Hello and welcome to the Center for American Institutions podcast, coming to you from the Sonoran Desert in beautiful Tempe, Arizona. My name is Robert Ferguson, and I am joined today by Dr. Jonathan Barth, who is an associate professor in the history department at Arizona State University and the associate director here at the Center for American Institutions. Dr. Barth, welcome.
Great to be with you. Thanks for interviewing.
Well, we really appreciate you sitting down. So, Dr. Barth, you've been at the center here for as long as anybody now. You've been here, what, 10 years at the Arizona State at the center?
11 years.
11 years. Oh, my goodness. So, you've seen it go through a few iterations by now.
That's right. Name changes and the whole gamut.
So, what attracted you to the center in the first place?
Well, to be honest, it was a way to jumpstart my career. I had just come out of George Mason University, defended my dissertation in 2014. If anyone of the listeners are familiar with the academic job market, it's not easy. And Donald Critchlow, who was the head of the center back then, it went under a different name, but he put out a job ad for a postdoc, and I saw that it had to do with political history and applied for the job. Got an interview, and Professor Critchlow gave me a chance, and I'll always appreciate him for that. So that's what initially brought me here. But the moment I came here in 2014, I knew right even before I came, just talking with Don over the phone, I could tell this is something very special, unique, and interestingly, I think the model, what we've been doing here, has now spread to other universities. But in 2014, this was one of a kind, and it still is to a certain degree. But I mean, you didn't see this anywhere else in 2014. And so I just really appreciated the opportunity that the center gave me coming right out of graduate school. I hadn't yet published my first book, and Don really had a lot of gave me that opportunity, and yeah, what we've built over the last 11 years is incredible.
Absolutely. And again, and I really appreciate what you built because it's given me an opportunity. So,
Yeah, that's right. I'm trying to think now how many postdocs we've had. Must be 7, 8, maybe 9. I'd have to really think long and hard about it, but yeah, you're the latest one, and one of the best, I think, we've had too. I must say, you're quite impressive yourself. But we're not interviewing you. So.
No, we're not here to interview me. I can pat myself on the back on my own time.
Yes.
So you grew up in Charlotte,
Mm-hmm.
correct? And how did you get into history? It is sort of a strange thing for somebody to get into. So can you maybe explain to the listeners how you became attracted to history?
Yeah, that's some great questions. Well, I think being on the East Coast, you are exposed to history in a in a way that other parts of the country maybe you don't get as much exposure to. You have the last Civil War battlefields out east. You have Revolutionary War battlefields. The Battle of Kings Mountain was fought not far from where I lived. Andrew Jackson and James K. Polk were born just a few miles from where I lived. So I was just exposed to that a lot as a kid anyway. And but I actually give a lot of credit to a pair of really excellent high school history teachers that I had that really, they just taught it in a way that made history come to life. And I was already interested in history anyway. My dad was into history, but those two history teachers that I had really inspired me to get into teaching, to go into that field. And when I went to college, I decided to major in secondary education with a history concentration. And the plan initially was to teach high school history. And I did that for 2 years, then went on to graduate school. But that was where I developed my love for teaching history. And so I attribute a lot to them. As far as the subject of history, I really I enjoy literature a lot and reading fiction. Try to read fiction on a fairly regular basis. what I really love about history is, you know, well, many of your listeners are probably familiar with F.A. Hayek's theory of spontaneous order. And I've applied that to the study of history versus um, the writing of fiction and literature. Hayek argued that a society organizes itself best when it's not centrally directed, when things are able to happen freely and spontaneously. And when you're talking about fiction or a good novel, you have the author, and the author decides the character and the plot, and the whole narrative. And if it's a really good author like a Tolkien or somebody like that, it can really get a great story. But nevertheless, with history, you don't have that element. There's so much the unexpected. You just have things. It's cliche, but you have so many events in history that you just couldn't make up. And I really like that element to history. Like I don't teach this in my U.S. history class, but the French Revolution, foundations of democracy, we deal with the French Revolution. I mean, you couldn't make that up. I mean, the way things proceeded and the twists and the turns. The American Revolution is the same way. 1776, you just couldn't. It would be you just couldn't make up some of those things. And to know that it like really happened in like real life is like an amazing thing. So I think ultimately I like a lot of other subjects, but history tops it for me.
That's interesting. I'd never really considered the idea of the author as the central planner in literature.
That's right.
I'd never thought of it in those terms before.
Yeah.
And so you're right. History removes the central planner to the story.
That's right. Yeah. And even like if you believe like there's a central planner, it's like not human. It's like, divine providence or something, regardless of where the results are pretty, second to none. It's just you end up getting just an exhilarating chain of events. So I love history. It's great. And I love teaching history. Teaching's my passion. I love writing history as well, really do. And researching history is great. And that's why I ultimately went to graduate school, so I could research and write history and not just teach it. But teaching is a very core passion of mine. I take teaching very seriously. And if I had a position where all I did was research and write, it would feel like I was missing out. I really enjoy the teaching element.
Hmm. Yeah, I hear you. I mean, I think this is one of the things that attracts so many people to a role like you have, where you get the opportunity to do a little bit of research, to do a little bit of writing, but you also get to do that teaching, which I think we all enjoy doing so much. Um, so let's talk a little bit more about your teaching, if you don't mind. You really shaped the Foundations of Democracy course that we teach to a significant degree. I mean, you've been teaching it for how many years? The Foundations of Democracy.
Well, I have to give credit where credit is due. That was mostly the work of Critchlow.
Okay.
I came in a little later. I think the first time I taught that course was in 2019. So I did. I have contributed a number of the readings
Mm.
that have helped expand it a bit, and also dropped a few things here and there. So but the core curriculum, that was Professor Critchlow's work. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very innovative. Would you mind describing it a little bit just for people who might not know about it?
Sure. So we go through a number of different pivotal thinkers in the Western political philosophy, essentially, and start with Thucydides. Machiavelli's another figure. Locke, Hobbes, Rousseau, and a number of others. But the way the course is structured, we have for each unit, I guess you could call it, there's a lecture about the context in which that thinker or political philosopher was writing. Then there's a discussion of the reading associated with that week, and then there is a debate in which the students debate a central topic. So, for example, Machiavelli said that if you're a ruler, it's good to be both feared and loved, but if you must choose one, it's better to be feared than to be loved. And so students hash that out in debate. Oh, and so I think the format's excellent, and it doesn't, we don't pretend that it's an exhaustive review of the there there are parts of the canon, if you will, that are that don't make it, but we try to hit some of the biggest figures. And Thucydides, I think, is an interesting inclusion. You don't often hear of him included with some of the greats. I mean, he's well known, obviously, history of the Peloponnesian Wars, but I really enjoy opening with Thucydides and the Melian dialogues, and in part because what Thucydides is dealing with is this theme of human nature, and what are humans really like when you strip the veneer of civilization away, and what does it mean to be human? And because that theme of human nature is a recurring theme throughout the course, and it's one that political thinkers throughout history have wrestled with, and really, actually, one's own view on human nature will often you know often inform their view on the role of government, how much power should government have, and so on.
Right. Actually, and I wasn't intending to ask this question, but this is you've opened up a really interesting opportunity here, so I want to take advantage of it. How do you think historians generally view human nature?
Uh, hmm. I think if you zoom out and look at most historians through history, I think most of them have a pretty cynical view of human nature. It's hard not to when you study history. I think there's a great quote from Voltaire. I don't have it memorized, but he said something like, "History is, like being in a barren desert, and you have a few with a few things here and there that are worthwhile, and but it's a wasteland of just human misery." And there's a lot of truth to that. There's just history sometimes can be a bit depressing, but history is also, you see human brilliance and courage and resilience, and just the drive for progress and improvement. And I mean, how do you I have 1776 on my mind right now because we're approaching that period of my US history class. How do you how do you study 1776 and not feel inspired towards something like higher, So there, I can't say what historians today would think. I think progressives in general tend to have a much more um they would say optimistic, others would say naive view of what human nature is capable of. Rousseau, um, of course, famously argued and believed that humans are there's a certain perfectibility in human nature, and that it is human institutions and customs and traditions that keep man down, whereas the conservative believes that human institutions and customs and traditions actually constrain the worst passions in man, and sort of uphold civilization. So there is that divide, which sometimes translates to politically. But you know eh, you look at the last century. I mean, the last century was pretty bad as far as like death and misery, but so many good things too. So it's kind of a mixed bag. But
No, 20th century mixed bag is a
yeah.
20th century mixed bag.
Right. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
I like that. That's good. Well, you're a historian of colonial America and early America,
Mm,
correct?
correct.
And your first book, interestingly, and maybe, I don't want to say completely uniquely, but relatively uniquely, and focused on the 17th century British Empire from the American perspective.
Right.
And that book is, sorry, you want to tell us a little bit about that book before we dive in?
Sure. The book deals with 17th century. Actually began in the Creed, like Jamestown, like a settlement, setting it up, 1492 through the early 17th century. But the focus of the book is from 1607 to I ended 1696 for various reasons. I won't bore people on why I chose that date. But yeah, there's a lot of focus in colonial history on the 18th century and the lead up to the Revolution. But the 17th century was a time of there was a lot of tumult in the colonies, and the relationship between Britain and the colonies was in flux, and there were a lot of really fascinating events that took place in those early decades. And in my book, I retrace a lot of some of those events through a lens or perspective of money, and by that I mean that um, I think it's not it doesn't it's not a universally explanatory way to view that period. However, a lot of the political back and forth between London Empire and the colonies had to deal with economics,
Right.
economic, colonial resistance to economic regulations like mercantilism.
Right.
And I argue in the book that central to that debate was actually a concern over the money supply, and how, if you were to go to colonial America, early colonial America, you wouldn't have found a lot of money, not much in the way of coin. And and so, yeah, I just tell the history through that perspective. It hasn't ever been told through that perspective before, and I thought it just opened up maybe, perhaps some new ways of viewing that period.
Well, what I loved about it is, again, when you tell the story of the empire, of the British Empire,
Mhm,
and of course, central to the British Empire is control over money.
mhm. Yeah.
And yet somehow that story gets lost
Mhm.
so frequently.
Yeah.
And that, oh my goodness, that is the central policy of that is the central policy of the empire.
Yeah.
So can you actually broadly situate the 17th century British Empire for us?
Right. Very good question. Yeah, and the reason why money was so central is that that's what finances, your armies, your navies, your so much of there was a great book published in the late 80s by a man named John Brewer called Sinews of War, and how money and finance was, and he deals with post 1688 Great Britain.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, y- uh, you know, um, uh, really money finances a sword. And so these states, especially in this early modern age, where you have the rise of new nation states and nation building, money was central to that. Whereas England and Great Britain in the 17th centuries, it really is, it's post Elizabethan. So Elizabeth in the 16th century really awakened her reign, during her reign, although Elizabeth herself actually personally played a big role in this, awakened England's eyes across the Atlantic and to a wider world. This is an era in which you had a lot of Mediterranean trade, with merchants in London all of a sudden now trading all over the place, whereas it used to be much more localized. And the 17th century was an era where really that empire, that broader empire, came into its own. You had the early seeds during Elizabeth in the 1580s, 1590s, the Lost Colony Settlement. East India Company was formed right at the end of Elizabeth's reign. It was in the 17th century when that project really got started. However, it had not yet reached that 18th century. The pinnacle. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I don't know. I guess did the British Empire reach its zenith in the 18th century or 19th century? They're very different empires, very, very different empires. But the zenith of that first British Empire was definitely in the 18th century. But to understand that, you got to rewind a bit. In that 17th century, a lot of this was being hashed out. One of the interesting things about this early period is how freewheeling and haphazard the colonial project was. I mean, the Spanish crown was centrally commanding the viceroy of Peru and the viceroy of New Spain and Mexico. That was it. Same with France. New France was centrally directed by the French monarchy. In the English America, I mean, these were essentially private. Many of them were essentially private colonies. I mean, you look at like, for example, Jamestown was the Virginia Company, just a group of investors who came together. The Plymouth colonists, like, literally were like religious dissenters fleeing Holland, and they came up with the Mayflower Compact on their own without any direction from England. Massachusetts, that was the Massachusetts Bay Company. Pennsylvania was like the private dominion of William Penn. So you have it's just a very different, but all that was hashed out in the 17th century, and so yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So why does Britain want an empire in the 17th century? What purpose does it serve the British monarch, the British government, the lords, or the people of Britain? What value is there to them in actually having an empire?
Well, one of the things I show in my book is there was a pecuniary incentive, money. Um, Empire brings in wealth. You can colonize areas um, uh, that are able to produce goods or commodities that you previously imported from other powers. That's a big part of it. But I think it would be a mistake to attribute it only to materialistic concerns. Glory, pride and glory in the empire, wanting to have the English flag flying, in places, distant areas around the world. That was obviously a really big element behind it. So I think those two things probably,
Okay.
money and glory.
Right. And is there anything like what's changing globally in trade markets at the time that is that is creating that extreme demand in England for more resources? I mean, the demand for resources was not new in England. Obviously, it's a small island,
Mhm.
right? That doesn't produce a whole lot of certainly not many exotic goods.
Mm-mm.
And so is there anything that's changing at the time that's kind of giving them this desire or the is the dem- or creating this new demand?
Yeah, so in during that earlier Elizabethan period in the late 16th century, um, English merchants began trading to the Mediterranean, with the Mediterranean rather, and importing more exotic goods. Tobacco, for example, was introduced on the scene in like the 1590s or something. Actually, Sir Walter Raleigh helped to popularize it. That was purchased from the Spanish Caribbean, and in the beginning, actually led to some pretty big trade deficits with Spain because the English didn't have a native source of tobacco. You can grow tobacco in England technically, but it's not a quality product. I wouldn't smoke it. But with Virginia opening up, now all of a sudden, like, that could be produced in another colony. So I think just as England became as their tastes began to become a little more broadened, cultivated, whatever word you want to use, and um, that pricked consumer demand. Sugar's another one. I mean, sugar consumption in England doubled in the middle of the 17th century to 2 teaspoons a day. Yeah, and I looked it up. I only know that stat precisely because, again, I'm teaching it right now in my U.S. history class, and I was talking some about this. I don't go into tremendous details. It's a freshman level survey, but the average consumption of sugar in England, by the 1670 was about 2 teaspoons a day. I looked it up, average of what it is today, and it's 20 teaspoons a day today. But you, which is a lot. That's a lot of sugar. But 2 teaspoons a day was a lot, like, back then, and so um, as that consumer market was pricked and awakened, then yeah, you're gonna unless you want to run major trade deficits, you're gonna want to produce that.
Right, and I mean, I also if you're gonna even if you are not able to produce it and you want to purchase it from some other empire, you have to have means of purchasing it,
That's right.
right? And
Yeah.
for that, you're gonna need money.
Money or a product of equal value.
Right, right. So, like, can you explain you mentioned mercantilism. Are you able to explain mercantilism a little bit?
Sure, yeah. Mercantilism was the idea that the government ought to regulate trade, especially foreign trade, but not always foreign trade, but ought to regulate trade in such a way that maximizes, or um, on the whole, leads to trade surpluses and diminishes trade deficits. So a trade surplus was all important in the mercantilist mindset, and the government ought to intervene in any way possible to secure a trade surplus. Because if you have a deficit, you're going to have to make up that deficit with money, and money in those days was gold and silver. And one of the reasons why Spain, for example, um, fell on the world stage was they had all this gold and silver mined from the Americas, but most of it was exported abroad because they didn't. Sort of like the King Midas story. King Midas had a wish and just wished that everything he touched would turn into gold. Well, obviously that's foolish because you can't. You need other things, and Spain learned that lesson the hard way. Mercantilist said, "Look, what you need to do, you don't even need mines per se. Just make sure that you have trade surpluses." Now, Adam Smith later purported to debunk that idea in his inquiry into the causes of the wealth of nations. Um, and uh, Adam Smith said that the wealth of a nation is not defined by how much gold and silver you have like circulating in your economy. But the wealth of a nation is like what you produce and like volume of trade and all of that. So that um, ushered in a revolution of thinking in England on that issue. But that book came out in 1776. So
Right. Right. So can you just quickly maybe explain what a trade surplus actually is?
yeah. Um, so for example, uh, if well, England, for example, always designed regulations when England regulated American trade. They made sure that they always exported more goods to the colonists than they imported. So, um, uh,
And how would that differ, say, from like trade in like inter-empire trade, inter-imperial trade? So, for instance, like between Britain and Spain versus, say, Britain and the Americas.
yeah, okay, yeah, good question. Yeah, so Britain and Spain is pretty easy. Like, are you buying more things from them than you're selling? If
Right.
so, then you have a trade deficit, and that's bad. Um, Britain, even though British trade with the Americas was intra-imperial,
Mhm.
they still wanted the money to center in England. They wanted like the mother country to be like the home like base or home seat of the wealth of the empire. So the British government designed the colonial markets to be dependent on the British and made sure that they ran just perpetual deficits, or that the colonies were running perpetual deficits with
Right.
England.
Otherwise, why have an empire?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Whereas the colonists, the way they viewed the empire was a lot more holistically. Like, hey, they're like, why does it all have to center in England
Right.
versus like, so, but, and this was especially, I mean, by 1775, eve of the revolution or the year of the war, if you count Lexington and Concord, the, there's 2.5 million colonists living in the 13 colonies, you know. So they by 1775, a lot of them are figuring like, what gives, This is like, are we going to just perpetually be in this subordinate relationship where, we're forced to import goods from England because England, insists on having these major trade surpluses with us, and how does that benefit us? And there
Right.
was just it was a lot of resentment about that.
Sure. And what I love about your book is that you actually, there's sort of, I think, this idea in American history where this resentment towards England kind of emerges for the first time after the 7 Years' War. But in your book, you show that that resentment is there from the beginning of the settlements. Like
Yes.
in the 17th in the early to mid 17th century, there's already a lot of tension between the American colonies and Great Britain.
Absolutely, and it ebbed and flowed, to be sure. Uh, in a lot of ways, it after the 1690s, things solidified a bit, and some of that old turbulence settled down a bit. There are like exceptions to that. There were,
Well, I think Walpole salutary neglect.
yeah, that's right, yeah, and that Edmund Burke coined that term, by the way, the salutary neglect. Britain was not pursuing a policy of salutary neglect in the 17th century, and at least in the second half. And because during the we're kind of getting into weeds a little
Yeah,
bit.
let's get into
Right?
this. It's fine.
During the English Civil War in the 1640s, and then during you know, the crown is at war with Parliament. They're not thinking about like Massachusetts or and so like, and then even after the king's beheaded and Cromwell becomes Lord Protector, Cromwell actually was pretty ambitious outside of England. Like it was Cromwell who invaded Jamaica and brought Jamaica into the British Empire. Jamaica used to be a Spanish colony, but even so, Cromwell made no effort to try to control what was going on inside the different colonial governments. And so the colonists, by the time the crown was restored in 1660, were accustomed to self-rule. They had a free hand to do almost anything they wanted. They were trading freely with the Dutch. I talk a lot about this in my book. The Dutch offered them really good prices on goods, and there were economic advantages to trading with the Dutch. The English didn't like that because if the colonists are purchasing manufactured goods from the Dutch, are not purchasing them from the English, which
Affects the trade, the balance of trade.
which affects balance of trade. Exactly. So, when England after 1660, when the crown is restored, begins to like clamp down and exert some control, that led to like some pretty bitter conflicts
Sure.
with the colonial.
So what
Wait,
accounts for that change? I mean, obviously the crown is restored. However, the crown doesn't have to then change its policies towards the colonies. What's happened? Why does the crown decide that this is a good time to start enforcing these mercantilist laws?
Yes.
I get
Yeah. So when Charles, uh, the son of the beheaded king, comes on the throne in 1660. I mean, the empire is this is not his father's empire. I mean, like this is not Jamestown with starving death rates of like 80% in the first few years or something. These weren't like the pilgrim, 90 pilgrims having Thanksgiving dinner with some Indians or this was a very, very different empire now. And he looked across the Atlantic, or maybe probably more accurately, his ministers looked across the Atlantic. We call it a cabinet here in the United States, but that's essentially the ministry. Looked across the Atlantic and they saw a thriving empire that had not yet been tapped. They saw potential for revenue, uh, and mostly in the form of like uh, tobacco and sugar, and they saw these cash crops and they also looked at their rival, the Netherlands. The Dutch were in the golden age at that time, and they saw that the Dutch were just making a killing from trade, not just in the Americas but all over the world. I mean, you had the Dutch East India Company dominating the Spice Islands and the East Indies, and so the crown also, the crown also was interested in having a revenue independent of Parliament. So there's a lot of things that went into play here. Um, we're really getting into the weeds here,
no, no, no.
Robert.
Go,
I'm
go.
okay doing it. So, like in Virginia, for example, which had become a royal colony after 1624, the king collected a tax on all tobacco, and that went straight into the royal coffers. That's is called quitrent revenue. That's a you know that's solid revenue for the king. Um, anytime sugar from the Caribbean islands, which was like just going gangbusters in the mid 17th century, that was taxed upon entry into England and went straight to royal coffers. The in, duties and other tariff imposts was the royal revenue. So yeah, I think that was the motive, and they didn't like. I mean, they looked at some of these legislators in the colonies, and they thought, like, from the British perspective, they were uppity. They were, they would look the other way when they would just blatantly ignore uh, the Navigation Acts, which was the British laws restricting colonial trade, and King James II, who came to the throne in 1685, decided to just do away with them altogether and established a fairly autocratic form of governance. And
Yeah, let's talk about that. That's actually really interesting. And the first time I encountered that story, because I really didn't know that, was in Peter Oliver's book, The Tory Perspective on the Rebellion. And at the end of one of his chapters, he sort of throws away some in this long essay where he's criticizing the colonists. He has this one throwaway where he goes, "Of course, what James did was outrageous, but we can just forget about that." So could you explain a little bit about, you mentioned what he did, but can you go a little bit into more detail there
yeah,
about what
so
James did?
yeah, so James was the younger brother of Charles II. Also, James was the son of the beheaded Charles I, who was beheaded in 1649. He grew up as a young adult in France in exile. Converted to Roman Catholicism in the early 1660s, which didn't win him many friends in England. And he also developed an admiration for uh, the French absolutism. His cousin was Louis XIV. You know how those royal families, just a lot of intermarriage and everything. And James came to the throne in 1605 with very ambitious plans. We have to remember when we hear absolute monarchy, from in the late 17th century, absolute monarchy was seen as one of the most efficient forms of government. It was it was parliamentary governance that caused so much chaos and civil war. And if you had an energetic, vibrant monarch on the throne, um, what could be more efficient than to just have him, running the show? And Parliament was, France didn't have a parliament. The Estates General, I think, last met in 1614. So if you could get away without governing with a parliament, why not? And James gave it a try. He dissolved Parliament within a few months of becoming king. And yeah, and he just wanted to consolidate power and put a military governor in charge of New England. And they abolished representative assemblies, arrested ministers. There was a popular minister in Massachusetts who was arrested, telling the people that no taxation without representation, that originated from that era. He was promptly arrested without due process. Town meetings were banned. It was pretty a dark time for New England. But so it didn't last long, because in the summer of 1688, some Whig merchants, and the Whigs were the opposition
In England.
in England. Thank you. Some Whig merchants in England, in London, secretly wrote a Dutch prince, William of Orange, who happened to be married to James's daughter, Mary. So he was James's son-in-law, and invited him to invade England. Essentially, in so many words, they didn't say it outright, but it was implied, offering him the crown, perhaps if he succeeded. And William happily did so, and invaded England with a 20,000 man Dutch army across the English Channel. James was called, tried to rally the army. The army stood down. James realized what was happening and hightailed it out of England. Lived in exile in France until his death in 1702.
Right. And that and from the colonial perspective, that changes things.
So that happened on the 5th of November, 1688. It's called the Glorious Revolution because there was very little bloodshed, almost none to speak of. Word of what had happened, it took about a good 6 to 8 weeks to travel across the Atlantic in those days. There was no telegraph or anything like that, of course. And and news began to leak about something's going on.
I can only imagine the rumors that are coming out. Like, something is happening. Not sure what it is, but something is happening.
Yeah, all unsubstantiated. Some of them were like wild rumors.
I was telling, I'll get back to it in a second. A quick sidebar. On 9/11, the day just passed, I was in the middle of the wilderness at a wilderness retreat when it happened for 4 days. And the 9/11 happens on the first day. And all we have is a shortwave radio. That's the only connection out to the outside world. So we knew something had happened, but you wouldn't believe the outrageous stories that a bunch of grade 10s had concocted in the woods for 4 days as to what had actually happened.
Oh,
So,
yeah, that's wild.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I can only imagine what it's like in
Yeah.
England.
Yeah, so and then, like, once news did start to trickle in, like, Andros, who was the military governor, like, tried to suppress it and was acting all nervous, and but then once it was confirmed, like, thousands of, men in Massachusetts marched on Boston and arrested Andros and shipped him back to England for trial.
And does that happen across the colonies?
Yeah, there was a in Maryland, there was a revolt as well against the, governor there. His name was Francis Nicholson, and there was a revolt, excuse me, in New York. Unfortunately for those rebels, William and Mary, who became joint sovereigns after 1688, disapproved of what they had done, and actually the leader of the revolt in New York was executed. His name was Jacob Leisler. It's not terribly important, but
Hmm.
yeah,
Interesting.
yeah,
Very interesting.
yeah.
Yeah. Then what changes in the 1690s from the perspectives from those perspective of the colonies? You said you end the book at 1696.
I do,
Why
yeah,
why do we end the book at 1696?
yeah. So 1696, you have the really the last and final navigation act. You have the empire just after 1688. A lot many the constitutional like questions weren't completely resolved, but things settled down in a sense. You had new monarch on the throne. Um, the authority of parliament was now like officially acknowledged and respected. You had an English Bill of Rights was passed in 1689. Um, the the colonists after the Glorious Revolution really came to view the British Empire as a positive good that protected their constitutional liberties as Englishmen. And that would include even if you were like an ethnic German or ethnic Dutch who were living in the 13 colonies, like you were grafted into that as well. You also enjoyed those liberties.
Now we're talking about money. Does the foundation of the Bank of England play a role?
Yeah, the Bank of England was founded in 1694. Um, as far as I can tell, I'm not sure what it plays a huge role in English finance, obviously, in the 18th century. This, I don't deal with much of it in the book because it was localized to England. But yeah, that was happening at the same time. There was also like a giant recoinage in England in 1696, and but yeah, I view that as just a watershed moment in which the beginning inauguration of a new epic that really lasted until 1763. Like if you had gone to the average um, English American colonist in say 1740, they would have been some of those
Patriotic
patriotic. Yeah.
Englishmen you
Oh
might
yeah.
find.
Yeah. I mean, the
Right.
thought of independence was like not only was it out of the question, it was not on the radar screen at
Right.
all. And if anybody talked about that, it would have been a revolting thought. Well, because like you would have like, well, so what were we going to be like French colonists? Are we going to be part of French empire instead? I don't think so. Look at how they deal with their people, and we don't want to be part of the Spain,
So the
the Spanish
Spanish Empire, I mean, the
forget
Spanish
it.
Empire were legendary for their cruelty, and
And until 1763, the French were in Canada, and as you are well aware, and that was a perpetual threat. Like
right.
that, you have the French, like kind of looming large there in the north and west of New England and New York, and so and then the French were also moving into the Ohio Valley, and they had Indian allies. The English had Indian allies too, namely the Iroquois. But it was a dangerous world. You didn't want to be independence. And Parliament wasn't really doing anything that you could really that was seen as overtly oppressive. There were acts that Parliament passed that the colonists objected to. The Molasses Act of 1733 that increased, duties on trade with the West Indian colonies, or there were a few paper currency acts where Parliament restricted the colonial government's ability to issue paper money and that would raise a little bit of a ruckus, but nothing like substantial. The thing,
Especially with the lingering external threats
yes,
of France, Spain, and various Indian groups.
yep,
The thought, being in the post 1688 English Empire appeared to be as good as it was likely to get.
yeah,
It's not like they didn't have utopia was not an option. They could see the options, and this appeared like the best one.
absolutely.
Right.
That changes radically after 1763. The French menace was removed after the French and Indian War. The Britain now had command of Canada, so that menace was removed, and Britain, and you can understand why, uh, began to press the colonists harder for revenue, and it was ultimately a very, very foolish errand because even if the British had collected all of the revenue from the Stamp Act, it actually would have made only a tiny dent into the national debt. Politically, it was a disaster for Great Britain because it was here with the Stamp Act in 1765. You had something that the colonists viewed correctly, I would say, I would add, viewed as a constitutional violation. Now, there is no constitution in England like we have, but there is an understanding of a constitutional framework, an unwritten collection of a body of laws, statutes,
Conventions,
conventions.
yeah.
That's right, and you don't violate those. And the Stamp Act violated it on a number of levels. And it wasn't just taxation without representation. It also, you were presumed guilty and you had to prove your own innocence. They established vice admiralty courts in which people would be tried. And there were a number of elements about that just really rubbed people the wrong way.
Yeah, and I think that, the Vice Admiralty course, it really something like that's always struck me is that, when, there was a historian that talked about Halifax, and when Cornwallis controlled Halifax, and the amount of hangings that took place always sort of shocked my mind
Mhm.
just from, the masts of ships,
Yeah,
right?
right.
And you realize what that actually means in military control from the British perspective.
Yeah, yeah.
And so if all of a sudden that appears, even the threat of that appears,
Mhm.
it's pretty frightening.
Yeah.
So your current, and we're gonna wrap this up fairly quickly, but your new research is on the continental dollar, and I really do want to make sure we talk about that. So, why do historians and economists care so much about the continental dollar?
Well, it's the original US dollar. It's called the dollar because it was based on the Spanish piece of eight, which was sometimes called the Spanish dollar. So it's a silver coin that weighed just a little shy of an ounce of silver, and it was sometimes called the Spanish dollar because it was equivalent in size and weight to a very popular German coin on the continent called the Thaler. Anyway, when the war kicked off in April 19th, 1775 at Lexington and Concord, the Second Continental Congress convened a few weeks later and realized very quickly we're going to need an army. We're going to need, yeah, and again, this goes back to what we said earlier. Like, how do you finance a military? You need money, and the problem was they just didn't have much money. They meaning the Congress. That there was no treasury with ready to go money, and the supply of coin wasn't, it had improved over the 18th century compared to previous century, but it still wasn't as vast as one might hope. So the Congress decided to print paper money, and on the bill it said, that this bill, and it's issued by the Continental Congress, entitles a bearer to one milled Spanish dollar. Milled was they put grooves on the side of the coin to prevent people from clipping silver from the edge, entitles a bearer to this many Spanish dollars if it was $1 or $10 or whatever. There was no redemption mechanism set into place. It was just, you're entitled to this, but there was no clear procedure about what does that mean exactly. I'll be honest, well, two things. The Congress had no choice. sometimes people, I'll hear, especially like hard money guys, will be like, pick on the Congress for printing paper money founded on nothing. And it was founded on nothing except just hope, hope that we're going to win. But what else were they supposed to do? They had to come up with something. And the other point I would raise is that it retained its value pretty darn well for the first couple of years. And for first year and a half, and then things did begin to spiral. Eventually, it fell to almost virtually nothing in value. Um,
And that's, I think, maybe why people remember it
right.
is the catastrophic inflation,
Yes.
right, of 1778, 980 kind of thing.
Yeah, that's bad.
Right. And so why do you think that happened?
Well, they just printed too much. Excess printing. There was also a lot of waste in the commissary departments and quartermaster departments. These were the departments in charge of, because what were they? So the way the Congress would do it, they would pass it. It's not like the Federal Reserve today, where you have the Federal Reserve today. They have a meeting of like the Board of Governors and some of the heads of the different federal districts, and Congress doesn't decide monetary policy in our system today. Well, Congress did decide monetary policy then, and they literally would pass an act like authorizing a new emission of $5 million or something like that. The Treasury would print that money, and then it would then had that money was available to raise new regiments, pay officer salaries, pay bounties to recruit soldiers, pay for provisions, tents, blankets, munitions. You could just think of a million things that they would have spent on rum. You always had. I see it over and over again. The soldiers complain there's not enough rum. Like I'll be honest. I probably want some rum myself before a battle.
Well, not only that, I mean, the amount of pain you would be in on a daily basis and the drudgery it would
Yeah.
send the
So it required a lot of money, but there was a lot of corruption inside these departments, and so there was waste for sure that contributed to some of it. But yeah, no, I mean it just and then it fed on itself because as the value of the continental dollar declined, that meant you needed more continental dollars to buy things, which means that Congress had to print more, which then contributed, snowballed the inflation.
Sure. Now I'm assuming the representatives are not ignorant of this.
No,
They understand what is likely to happen.
they knew exactly what was going on.
Right. But they proceeded anyway.
Well, they tried other options. They tried floating. They tried floating what we would call like treasury bonds. They're called continental certificates, loan certificates.
And who would they be selling this to? People in the United States or abroad?
Well, they tried both, but in the United States, what this would involve, if you were like a merchant or something, and you had 500 continental dollars, you could invest in continental bonds, earns 6% interest, annual interest. The problem with that was the inflation rate was usually greater. The depreciation was greater than 6%, so it was a loser. So loans didn't work out very well. Also, they tried to negotiate loans with France and Holland, and Spain. France was a big help. French loans actually were and the French their loans, some of the loans were most of the loans were interest free. France obviously had a stake in the Americans winning that war, and so that was a big help, but it wasn't able to cover everything.
So I have a question out of pure ignorance. Is it were the French loans, were they to the Continental Congress or would they have been to, various like state legislatures?
To a Continental
To
Congress.
the Continental
Yeah.
Congress. Okay.
Yeah. There actually were a few states that tried to negotiate loans abroad in Europe, and Congress was pretty furious at that because some of the states were offering to pay higher interest than what Congress was offering. They're like, come on, guys. Like Virginia tried that, for example. They were like offering 7%.
Well, Virginia, if you don't know, we are the grandest of the states here. We can yeah, we can do this, right?
Yeah. So, but no, what the French would do, there were a few times where they sent specie, but they would send bills of exchange. to Congress, and then the Congress had like bills of exchange operate like a check back in those days, and
Yeah, it might be actually worth explaining what a bill of exchange is.
a bill of exchange.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a useful concept to anybody who studies economic or who reads economic history. It's a word that comes up a lot. It took me a while to figure out what it
Yeah,
was.
it's not exactly equivalent to a check, but it's very close. So like if you're renting from a landlord or whatever, you write a check, and on that check, like let's say you use, Chase Bank or whatever, and it says Chase Bank on the check, you write it out. It has your name on it. You write it out. It's an order to Chase Bank to pay to whoever you endorsed it over to pay that person money, X amount of dollars. And a bill of exchange is a written order for from one party to another party that has funds that belong to you on hand to pay X amount to this person. It what it does is it precludes the necessity of carrying around coin, which is dangerous. Not just highway robberies if you're overland, but also shipwrecks and
Right, and I mean, and in your book, you talk about the importance of British privateers preying on the Spanish
yeah,
on the treasure fleet.
yeah, that's right.
So
Yeah, yeah. So no, the French were a really, really big help. A really big help that came through. And even before the alliance was official, they were, I mean, in the first year of the war in 1775 into early 1776, I mean, they were providing the bulk of the like gunpowder and
hmm.
yeah.
And so your current project is narrowly focused on the continental dollar,
Yeah,
correct?
it is, but yeah. But there's a well, here's the confusing thing, and this is what uh this didn't help matters any. Each state issued their own paper money too. So so I deal a little bit with that. I don't detail it obviously as heavily. I mean, that would just make for a slog of a book. But like, so my focus is on the continental dollar, but I do deal with these other state currencies that were being, and I do deal with like the attempts at loans. So I've involved that. But yeah, so my argument in that book essentially, or the way it's coming out, I'm like writing it right now. I've completed most of the research. At the continental dollar, they couldn't have won without it, but they almost lost because of it. And like it, I mean, it was it was a mess, hot mess.
I love that characterization right there. That's great. They couldn't have won without it, but it almost cost them their victory too.
Oh yeah, yeah. So
Well, and I think that's one of the talking about history and the spontaneous order of it and the complete chaos that is history.
yeah,
I mean, I think that kind of neatly gets at that point,
yeah,
right? That the necessity of it, and yet the absolute weaknesses inherent in that everybody acknowledges the weakness in it, even at the time,
yeah.
but they're pursuing it anyway. So
Yeah, yeah. The French later picked up on some of this idea too during their own revolution, because a big part of the reason for the French, the big problem that the French crown was facing in the 1780s was the debt, much of which um, they had procured in defending the United States.
and we're struggling to recoup from the United States.
Right, and the after 1789, the National Assembly decided to begin paying off that debt with paper notes called the assignat, which were paper monies backed by confiscated church lands. But that the idea was, okay, we're going to nationalize these church lands. The church owned like 10% of the country of the land in France, and so they confiscated that money and then issued these paper notes to bondholders, um, whom the French who had lent the French government money through all those years, and then those notes were supposed to be used to buy up those lands, but there too they overissued, and that that ended up being quite the a lot of havoc there. Robespierre started guillotining shopkeepers who were, raising prices above the maximum that he had established. So yeah, money's there's this as you know, I mean, because you do a lot of your work is in the same subject, just 20th century, but it's every now and then it really rears its head as a major issue, and then it will subside for a bit. And you see this across U.S. history later in the 19th century, which is outside of my time period. For now, maybe later I'll delve into it. You have the bank war during the Jackson administration, during the 1870s, the rise of the free silver movement, which, came to a peak in the 1896 election with William Jennings Bryan and William McKinley, where bimetallism was like the number one topic. Who would ever think, that that the debate over the ratio between gold and silver would dominate a presidential election, but it did in 1896. Then you had the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, and during FDR, the emergency banking acts and gold confiscation, and then the revaluation of gold at to $35 an ounce instead of $20.67 an ounce, and then you have the inflation in the 1970s, Nixon going off the gold standard on August 15th, 1971.
Yeah, and I mean,
Yeah.
I think money has, and we are running out of time here, so I don't want to go too far into this, but that um, I think a bunch of Americans are appreciating the political nature of money, perhaps in a way right now than they have in a generation, at least since the 1970s. And so, what would your advice be to people who are interested in maybe understanding our moment, as far as we have not only do we have concerns about the American dollar, de-dollarization, bond markets that appear to be driving domestic policy in ways, certainly in the United Kingdom, but in the United States as well. And then, people seeking alternatives, these digital currencies
Mhm.
that are dominating discussions and scaring certain people and empowering others. What are what less does history have any lessons for this moment when we're thinking about this kind of bizarre currency moment that maybe we're living in?
Yeah. I actually, the whole reason why I got into monetary history, in general was after the 2008 financial crisis. I became deeply interested in monetary policy in our current day. Began researching the Federal Reserve and trying to really beginning to understand it for the first time. This elusive institution that like very, very few Americans really understand. And it's just filled with jargon and seems almost like hopelessly complex. And it is complex, but it's
It's
very,
complex,
very
but
important.
it's complex, but it's Newtonian. It's not like Einsteinian.
Yeah, yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. It can be understood, but but it's extraordinarily important, and it impacts everything in the economy. And so I do think it's important for people to have a basic literacy in financial literacy, but also just like what our money is. And I think it's worthwhile doing. One of the things I did in 2020 during the whole COVID thing, put my um, I put my history of money course, which is a course that um, I teach. I put my history of money course on YouTube and included in there some videos explaining, trying to break down the Federal Reserve, how it functions, and attempting to explain it for the educated layperson.
Hmm.
And because I agree with you, I think it can be understood and it ought to be, but it is complex. But people should know like how money is. It used to always be a mystery to me. I remember like looking as a kid, like, why is this bill $20 and this one's $10? Like that makes no sense. And like, how was this even created? Like, who made this? Like, and never really understanding that question until I was like, my late 20s. And I think it's good to, like I said, have a basic literacy. And I like a lot of the digital stuff. I was an early, and I played early in Bitcoin. In 2013 is when I bought my first Bitcoins. Unfortunately, I didn't hold on to them. That would have been that.
Yes, I know how that feels.
I might not be like sitting here right now if I had held on to them.
Uh, yeah, I know exactly how that.
Oh, okay. Well, we may have to talk a little bit about that after the interview, but yeah, I like Bitcoin and Ethereum. I think they're here to stay. People have been prophesying their doom forever. I don't think they'll ever be currency. I don't think they'll ever be money. I define money as has a commonly accepted medium of exchange. Bitcoin can't be a commonly accepted medium of exchange, in part because, and this isn't the only reason, I do think there is an inherently deflationary aspect to Bitcoin. As usage increases or as investment in it increases, it rises in price. Well, if your money is for anything that's any asset, but especially if you want it to be a money, if it's rising in value, that's a disincentive to spend it. And that disincentive to spend, I think, limits Bitcoin's uh, functionality as a money. I view it as a digital asset and a very valuable digital asset. I don't know where humanity is going to be in 100 years, but if humans are around and kicking in 100 years, I would be willing to bet a lot that Bitcoin's going to be around. It's gonna be a lot.
All of the Bitcoin you currently don't own.
Yeah, right. No, it's here to stay. It's not going anywhere. But it's not going to be money. It'll just be a digital asset, and its value will be in its privacy, which is very valuable in the 21st century, immensely valuable in the 21st century. And then Ethereum has a lot of value in a lot of things I don't quite understand, but it has value in with different digital applications and things. So these aren't going anywhere. Stable coins are, I think those have a lot of potential as a money. The stable coins are pegged to a national currency. So like a stable coin, based on the US dollar, it's pegged 1-to-1 to the US dollar. And you can, if you have a payment to make that crosses borders, or if you want to send money instantaneously without having like an ACH, bank to bank transfer, you can use a stable coin. Trump recently signed an act into law in July regulating stablecoin issuers that should provide some stability to the market. So those are going to be around. Those will function more like a money. But yeah, so and then gold and silver are always going to be around. I mean, shoot, gold's like $3,500 an ounce right now. It's like insane. Like that's like I remember like when I first started tracking gold's movement, like 2006, it was like $400. It's like, so it's like completely gone off the charts. Silver, is also always going to have value. So there are a lot of, if you're into this subject, there are a lot of different ways to get into it, but don't ever put your eggs all in one basket. So
Yeah.
idea.
Well, before you put, is your course still up on YouTube?
Yeah, it
Do
is.
you want to just tell people where they can find it?
Yeah, I don't have the URL, but
No,
go on YouTube, type in Professor Barth.
Okay,
Bam.
that's
You'll see it.
good.
I have a whole playlist on there. History of Money playlist.
No, that's great because again, I think people are looking for. I certainly know I've had a lot of conversations in my life with people who are interested in this subject and really, but there's a big, really steep learning curve. I mean, and if you really get into it, you start, the way that I always put it is that you're not drinking from the fountain, you're drinking from Niagara Falls with all the information,
Yeah.
and it's very technical, and it can get very intimidating very quickly. So something like that, I think, would be really helpful for people. And oh, you didn't actually say the name of your book. What's the name?
The Currency of Empire, Money and Power in English America in the 17th Century. It's $20 on Amazon, or it's also free. The PDF is free. I worked out a deal with Cornell University Press, who is a publisher, to have open access. So you can go on the Cornell website and download the PDF for free, or you could buy it.
I think everybody should buy it.
I will be honest, the royalties are very slim, so it kind of doesn't matter to me.
You can't just put it in a Bitcoin.
No, just download it. It's nice to have the hard copy though. So
All right. Well, Dr. Barth, thank you very much.
sure.